Welcome to the Elizabeth Seton Lectures. The Religious Studies Department of Mount St. Vincent, with the sponsorship of the Sisters of Charity, is pleased to offer the 19th Annual Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series, and to bring this time to the Mount an outstanding expert in contemplation. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to continue our custom of recalling at the opening session the origin and purpose of the Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series. I would ask Sister Martha Westwater, Professor Emerita in the English Department, and now Communication Director for the Sisters of Charity. Sister Martha.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Sisters of Charity, it is my pleasure this evening to welcome you to the 1996 Elizabeth Seton Lectures. And an especially warm welcome do I extend to our brother in Christ, Father Robert Faricy. Most of you already know that the series was inaugurated in 1978 through an endowment made by the Sisters of Charity at the suggestion of the Sisters on faculty at Mount St. Vincent University. The general theme of the series is the Christian presence in the world, past, present, and future. We hope these lectures will be a tangible proof of our contribution towards the special environment at Mount St. Vincent University, an environment which the university's mission statement characterizes as being rooted in a Catholic tradition and marked by a strong commitment to understanding the truth, intellectual vigor, and social responsibility. These lectures are named in honor of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, foundress of the Sisters of Charity in North America, and it is fitting that this year the lecturer, Father Robert Faricy, will speak to us on Christian contemplation and Zen meditation. Our mother would have approved of the topic. All her life, Elizabeth contemplated the all in God and the God in all. She found God in all the events of her life. She loved totally. That was her contemplation. Elizabeth Seton was an ordinary woman. She lived as a daughter, sister, wife, mother, friend, and in all these situations she found the opportunity for love. She grew in contemplation through the same life crises that we have to live, sometimes with great pain and anguish, sometimes with great joy. She found the courage to open herself to each new phase of life. When her mother died when she was only 3 years old, when her father remarried, when she had to move from relative to relative because of family difficulties, when she married William McGee Seton and became the mother of 5 children, when her father died, when her husband became ill and died, when she lost all her material wealth, when she made the decision to join the Catholic Church and was disowned by her relatives, when she had to leave New York, the home of her birth, and go to Baltimore to open a school, when she struggled to let her sons live their own lives and make choices she did not want for them, when she sat at the deathbeds of two of her daughters still in their teens, and of many of the young women who joined her in the little community of sisters she established. Elizabeth's choices in all these ordinary situations shaped her character and contributed to her contemplative spirit. It was in and through them all that she became a contemplative, holy and whole. Do you think such contemplative love was easy? No, indeed. Her capacity for loving had to be stretched in wrestling with the places within her that rebelled at the pain, that were confused and overwhelmed by events, where she lashed out at life, where she was angry and defensive when she couldn't meet all the needs of her children, when she met with narrow-mindedness and prejudice. But her contemplative longing for God, that longing that had been with her from childhood, and her trust in God's providential care, strengthened her in her life's search for union with God. May our beloved St. Elizabeth Seton be with us as we learn more about a life of contemplation. And I would like to thank the Religious Studies Department at Mount St. Vincent University for their usual careful planning of these lectures. Let me close once more by welcoming you once more to this series of the Elizabeth Seton Lectures. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Martha. It is now my privilege to introduce tonight's topic and speaker. Our topic tonight is Christian contemplation. For Henri Nouwen, contemplation is to empty ourselves so as to make space for God and to the least of our sisters and brothers. It's getting God's tan. To get a suntan, we have to lay in the sun. Well, to get God's tan, we have to stay in God's presence. Mind you, while getting a suntan, we have to avoid sunburns and cancers of the skin, etc. The same about getting God's tan. We have to be careful. Speaking of Henri Nouwen, I learned this morning that he died of a heart attack last week at 63 years old. He was in Holland on his way to Russia to reflect on his latest book, The Prodigal Son. He was buried yesterday at daybreak, L'Arche Community near Toronto. And I would invite you to stand up for a 1-minute silence to honor Henri Nouwen's gift to us. Thank you. In his eulogy yesterday, Brian Clark said, "There are two more things Henri Nouwen would have liked to have done. Writing another book about his death and celebrating this ceremony." Henri, in one article on contemplation, among many others, said that to contemplate is to see, while to minister is to make visible. The contemplative life is a life with a vision, and the life of ministry is the life in which this vision is revealed to others. We are fortunate this evening to have Reverend Robert Faricy, to help us to see better. Robert Faricy is Professor of Spiritual Theology, especially of contemplative prayer, at the Pontifical Georgian University in Rome. A member of the Society of Jesus, he is a widely published author and a noted international lecturer. His extensive study of Zen Buddhism took him to Tokyo, Kyoto, Bangkok, and Seoul, Korea, where he studied under a Zen master in a Buddhist monastery. It is with great pleasure that we welcome Father Robert Faricy to Mount St. Vincent University. Robert.
There are a couple of problems right away talking about Christian contemplation. One of the problems is that we're in the area of mysticism, Christian mysticism, and Christian mysticism historically was pretty well rejected totally by the Protestant Reformation. However, in this century, starting about in the beginning of the century, there's been a terrific comeback of Christian mysticism, and particularly of contemplative prayer in the Reformation Protestant religions. The so-called Catholic religions, like the Roman Catholicism, Anglicanism, the Orthodox churches, the Coptics, they've always kept a tradition of contemplative prayer. But the various Protestant religions of the Reformation did not. However, what I've found, and I can't find any statistics on it, but I do have a lot of impressions, and I've talked to a lot of people, what I've found is that contemplative prayer is widely practiced and understood and practiced with real wisdom and grace in practically all of the Protestant churches, at least the ones I know. Certainly strongly in the Pentecostal and Charismatic churches, among the Baptists, among the Methodists, but also in other churches of the Reformation. And when I give talks like this, as I do once in a while, and people don't usually ask you, to talk on contemplative prayer. So when they ask me to talk about something in the area of Christianity and Buddhism, I jumped at contemplative prayer because you don't get a chance to talk about it much. But I do whenever I can, whenever I have any kind of a choice. And I find that people that will come to a talk like this to hear what I have to say are not just Catholics. And very often they're members of Reformation Protestant churches who have very serious prayer lives and who have been practicing contemplative prayer with the grace of God for years. So that problem we can forget about. The second problem is that the problems we have with the theologians. I am, of course, a recovering theologian. And the theologians tell me that mysticism is ineffable. And since it's ineffable, I learned how to pronounce that especially for this talk. Since mysticism is ineffable, I can't really talk about contemplative prayer, or for that matter, Zen meditation. Well, they're not going to shut me up that easily. I'll agree that there is a certain ineffability when you're talking about contemplative prayer, when you're talking about contemplation. But let us call it a weak ineffability. I'm not just rationalizing my own forthcoming lack of articulateness, which you will soon perceive. It is hard to talk about contemplative prayer. It's hard to say things about it. The contemplative experience is ineffable in a way, with what we can call a weak ineffability. It's a little hard to talk about because it has analogs, but there's nothing really just like it. It's unique in its own, in its manner. What is it? What is Christian contemplation? The biblical image, which is traditional in Christianity of contemplative prayer, is the picture of Jesus at the home of Mary and Martha. Martha is busy in the kitchen preparing the meal, and Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet, looking at him, shutting up, and listening to what he has to say. And Martha complains, "Lord, get my sister to help me prepare the meal." And Jesus says, "Martha, you're busy about many things. Only one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the better part." What's the better part? Sitting at Jesus' feet, looking at him, listening not just with the mind but with the heart to him, and soaking up what he has to say and really who he is. Looking, then. Contemplating means looking. It's having an intention or an intent of the will that reaches out to God, present for us in Jesus Christ. That reaches out to Jesus not as I imagine him to be, but as he is. And of course, that's part of the problem. It would be easier to reach out to him as I imagine him to be, but it wouldn't be real. Teresa of Avila says, contemplative prayer is being with the one that I know loves me. And that's good. I think my two favorite definitions are the one we just heard from Henry Nouwen and that one of Teresa of Avila. What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about knowing the Lord, but when I say knowing, of course, I'm using the term knowing analogically and almost metaphorically, because I don't know Jesus the way I know Jacques Goulet. I've known Jesus longer, and in a certain sense I know him better, but in another sense I don't, because I can't see him, I can't hear him, and so on. So that contemplative prayer does involve knowing the Lord, but with a kind of unknowing, a dark knowing, a knowledge of the heart. I know him through love. I know him through the love I have for him, but which, after all, is pitifully weak compared with his own, and sometimes certainly unfelt. But I know him mainly through the love he has for me. He's risen, the Lord is risen, and that risen state means that he is transcendent of all our time and all our space and all individual persons, so that Jesus is present in a way that he could not have been before his resurrection and ascension to the right hand of the Father. He's present now in a transcendent way. He transcends time, space, and individuals, so that he can be and is present to each person here. For example, Jesus is present to me, giving me his full attention right now, and he's present to you, giving you his full attention and his love right now. And someone might say, I don't believe in Jesus. Well, all right. He believes in you, and the fact that you don't believe in him doesn't change reality. The reality is that he is risen, that he is present, that he's simultaneously totally present to every time, space, and individual person in history, past, present, and future, and that he's present to you right now, loving you. His love has your name on it, knowing who you are exactly, past, present, and future, knowing you're standing up and you're sitting down. You can go nowhere to escape from him, or from his love. And his love is not possession. On the contrary, he leaves you completely free, even to the point of not believing in him, much less paying any attention to the one who loves you and who is giving you his full attention. I know him mainly through his love of me. And I know, what do I know about that love? I know a few things from what he teaches about love in the Gospels, and I know he practices what he preaches, so what he tells me to do in loving others, I know that he does with respect to me better than I could ever do. For example, he says, judge not. I know he doesn't judge me. He says, condemn not. I know he doesn't condemn me. He says, forgive, and you will be forgiven, so I know he forgives me. He says, give, and it will be given to you. Pressed down, full measure, pressed down and overflowing. What does he give me? His life. So he died for each one of us, as though you and I were the only other persons besides him that ever walked on earth, and he'd do it again if he had to, if it served some useful purpose. It's that love that I know him through. The love that St. Paul describes in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. See, I'm a Catholic priest. We never get the verses just right. The Protestants, I think it's 4 through 7. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not boastful, love is not rude, love is not puffed up, which is the Greek word, right? Love is not puffed up. Paul is telling the Corinthians all through that first letter that they are puffed up. They're full of hot air. They think they're full of the Holy Spirit. It's a play on the Greek words, which are very similar. Flatulency and full of the Spirit are very similar words. And I hate to get vulgar, but it's Paul. I can't. I'm not going to apologize for him, right? So Jesus is not puffed up. He's not stuck up. He believes all things. He hopes all things. He endures all things because he is love. Jesus is God. God is love. So it's theologically correct to say that Jesus is love, and if he's love, he's everything that Paul says love is in 1 Corinthians 13. And it's through that love that he has for me that I know him. So this is a knowledge of the heart, not without the intellect, not without the mind, but essentially a dark knowledge. I mean, when you think about it, the only real knowledge we ever have of anyone is through love. I think it's important to know something about people. And I even think it's important to know a lot about Jesus. It's good. But it's not necessary. My father used to say, not without a certain amount of naivety, although he thought he was a great cynic, he used to say, it's not what you know that counts, it's who you know. He didn't say whom. We don't say that where I come from. He said, it's not what you know, it's who you know that counts. I think that's especially true of contemplative prayer. It's not what you know about Jesus, it's knowing him. And knowing him is not the same as knowing about him. It's good to know about him. And you can read the Bible and study theology and a lot of other things. But the main thing, why am I talking into this? I have a lavalier microphone, so I can move away. Can you still hear me if I move over here? Good, and then I'm not imprisoned. It's knowing Jesus. I have a brother who is a little bigger than I am. Actually, he's gotten a lot bigger sideways. But when we were growing up, we were about the same height and about the same weight. So my mother dressed us like twins, and we were very close, and we've always been close. And now, when I go back to St. Paul, where I'm from, I kind of hang out with my brother. We're a couple of old birds now, but we still like each other. We love each other. And we have almost nothing in common. Almost nothing. And I know hardly anything about him. He's an architect, but I don't know what he does, except that I'm sure he's doing what he's been doing since he was 1 year old, which is yelling at people. But but what do architects do? I mean, who knows? And he said to me once, what do you do? I said, I'm a priest. Yeah, he said, I know, but I mean, what do you do like all day? What do you do? I said, I don't know. I mean, how are you going to tell him? He wouldn't have understood. I could have told him I get up and I pray for an hour in the morning.
He doesn't have a clue. He wouldn't have any idea what I was doing during that hour. But we know each other through love. We really like being with each other. And we don't have to talk a lot. And we talk about I don't know what. I talk about what's interesting to me, and he talks about what's interesting to him, and I don't understand too much of what he's saying. And I never know why he says what he says, or why he acts like he's going to, why he acts like he does. But I know how he's going to act, and I know what he's going to say before he says it. I just don't know why. But I know him, and I know him through love, and that's why I can pretty well predict how he's going to react to something or what he's going to say. I just would never act that way, and I would never say those things because we're entirely different, but we know each other through love. That's contemplative prayer is like that. It's knowing Jesus through love, even when you don't know very much about him. I was telling Jacques just before this talk that I gave a talk on contemplation once in Philadelphia, and a man came up to me, and he seemed more than mildly retarded, a man about 35, 40 years old. And he had a little trouble expressing himself, but he seemed like a very good man. And he said, you know, Father, he said, you know, you were talking there about, I can't get the word, it's like something like that. Contemplation, I said. Yeah, he said, I do that. He was a bricklayer. He's a man that knows the Lord through love, and he doesn't know much about it. The man has this man, the bricklayer, has no education, but he's very close to the Lord. And he's a man that gets up in the morning, and before he goes off to lay bricks or haul bricks or whatever he does, he's with the Lord, face to face with the Lord, heart to heart with the Lord, eyeball to eyeball with the Lord. He's right there with him. In contemplative prayer. That's what contemplative prayer is. Knowing the Lord through love, not knowing about him. Knowing about him is theology or Bible study or something. Knowing him, that's something else. That's contemplation. And it's non-conceptual. It's non-conceptual prayer. It's prayer without or with very few words or ideas. Maybe I've got the name of Jesus in my heart, or maybe I'm repeating something like a mantra, or like in the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. Maybe I'm repeating that for so many years and so often it means nothing to me, but it's a vehicle for not having distractions, and it's a vehicle for putting me in touch, heart to heart, with the Lord. But it's not really a concept. I'm not using words. For example, the rosary can be contemplative. If I'm not thinking about what the words mean, I'm just kind of rattling them off the way most Catholics say the rosary. I'll say something about that later. But the rosary can be, I've known old ladies that sit in the back. If you go into churches in big cities, I'm sure there's a transient church in downtown Halifax, is there? Yeah, right. And is it open all day? Most of the time. Well, there's a little old lady there. I've never been there, but I know that she's either in the front pew or the back pew. And she's sitting there almost all the time, probably, saying the rosary. Probably, and I've talked to a number of these old ladies because I have a terrible combination of curiosity and chutzpah. And so I've talked to a number of these little old ladies, and they're way up there with the Lord. They got the highest contemplative prayer you can imagine. You take the rosary out of her hand, she doesn't know what to do anymore. She says the rosary during Mass, she says the rosary at weddings, funerals, riding the streetcar, going to church, in the church, going home. She's saying the rosary all day. I had an aunt like that, my Aunt Mary. Well, she's not thinking about the words. She's just knowing the Lord and his mother through love. She's looking at Jesus and Mary in the mysteries. It's contemplative prayer is what it is, knowledge of the heart. It isn't then exactly a knowing, it's kind of a, yeah, it's knowing in the dark. Like sometimes maybe the lights are totally out and you know that this other person that you love is in the room. You just know it. You know it. Maybe they're 10 feet away or something. but you know they're there, or 3 feet away. You know they're there. You just know they're there. And that's contemplative prayer, is a knowledge like that. The lights are out normally. Normally the lights are out, but I know the Lord is there in the darkness. Once a sister said to me, "Will you help me with my prayer?" I said, "Yeah, okay. Well, how much do you pray?" "An hour every morning." "Where?" "In church." "What do you do?" "Nothing." "Oh. How do you feel?" "Like a vegetable." So I said, "Your prayer's fine." She was okay. She said, "I feel numb." I said, "That's good feeling." Sorry. She's there with the Lord in the dark, in her numbness, having her desert experience with the lights out, but she's in contemplative prayer, maybe in a particular phase of it, but there she is, and she's doing all right. I'm sure she still is. What are the conditions of contemplation? What are the conditions of contemplative prayer? What do I need to have contemplative prayer? Well, in the first place, naturally, and we'll get this out of the way right away, contemplative prayer is a grace. All real prayer is grace. It's a gift from the Lord. And it used to be in Catholic theology, the people would say, well, contemplative prayer, that grace is not offered to everyone. But no one says that anymore. And I'm 70, and I don't know anyone younger than I am that says that. Maybe a few guys even older, but I don't think so. Nobody says it. The graces of contemplative prayer, the Lord wants us to have those much more than we do, infinitely more than we do. And they're available. The gift of contemplative prayer is available to everybody. So the first condition is that the Lord give you that grace and that gift. But that condition, we don't have to worry about that, because He's more than generous. He wants that kind of thing more than we do. What are the conditions of contemplative prayer from my point of view, from me, from my side? Well, one is I've got to be there. So time. I mean, if you're not there, people get mad when I talk about this, but I mean, you got to talk about it. So if it threatens you, sorry, you got to be there. I mean, if you're not there, you're not contemplating, right? I mean, it's a human activity. If you're not in the room, nobody's there doing it for you. So does that mean that I have to put in a certain amount of time every day? Yes, it does. Otherwise, the Lord doesn't have enough to deal with. It's not a question of being a timekeeper. I got a watch here, actually. It's not a bad watch. But the Lord, I'm firmly convinced, never had one. And He doesn't have one now. He's not a timekeeper. He doesn't say, okay, you prayed 58 minutes, you're supposed to pray an hour, that doesn't count. He doesn't do that. He's not a timekeeper. He's not watching every minute. But unless my commitment is sufficient so that I put in a substantial amount of time every day with the Lord, then my commitment is not sufficient that He can really bring me along in my relationship with Him, and that He can really lead me in contemplation and in my contemplative prayer. My commitment just isn't strong enough. It's not that He's a timekeeper, it's that He needs my commitment. And the way I can show that I love Him and not just tell Him, and I don't even have to tell Him if I'm showing it, the way I can show it is to be there. So time is important. It's important to be there. The second condition, and this is true in all religions, certainly true of Buddhism and any kind of Buddhism for meditation. The second condition is interior freedom. I have to have a relative interior freedom, a certain, you might say, indefinable minimum amount of interior freedom in order to be there, to be present to the Lord, present to me, loving me, in order to get into contemplative prayer. I have to have a certain amount of freedom. Otherwise, I'm distracted, for one thing. I'm distracted by all the things that I'm attached to. So what am I talking about? What my novice master used to call inordinate attachments. If I'm not free of inordinate attachments to things that take me away from the Lord, if I don't have a certain amount of freedom from those, I can't really be for Him. And I can't come before Him then and expect myself and Him to be there together in contemplative prayer. I can't do it. I need a certain amount of interior freedom. So am I talking about love? No. I'm not talking about love at all. I'm not saying if I love people too much, I can't have contemplative prayer. I'm not saying that at all. You can't love people too much. There's no such thing as loving too much. God is love. He loves everybody infinitely. So the problem is never that I'm too attached to people loving them. That's never the problem. The problem is not either that I'm too attached to things loving them, like loving art or loving music. That's not the problem. The problem is always selfishness. It's always possessiveness. Possessiveness of things, of money, of the good things in life, of good food, of, I don't know, watching the soaps, whatever it is. Possessiveness of things, or possessiveness of people. Loving with a closed fist rather than an open hand. Loving, manipulating the other person, not treating the other person like a subject, but more like an object. Using the other person to gratify my own needs, including psychological needs. Selfishness is always the problem. It's never love. So when I say detachment, I don't mean from loving. I don't even mean detachment from people. I mean detachment from my own selfishness and from my own possessiveness. That's what I mean. And unless I have a relatively high degree of that, I'm not going to be very capable of contemplative prayer. And I need, and again, this is common to a great many, to meditation and contemplation in a great many religious traditions, not just Christianity. I need a certain poverty of spirit. I need a kind of humility, lowliness, the lowliness of Mary, who says he has looked upon the lowliness of his handmaid. I need to have that. I need to have, I need to know who I am before the Lord. A sinner, forgiven, yes, but still a sinner. A forgiven sinner. A forgiven sinner, I need to have a kind of a lowliness, a sort of humility before the Lord in order to come to Him, to be sufficiently open to His presence to engage in contemplative prayer, in contemplation. For example, there are a lot of strange things in the gospel that are hard to explain, and I'm not even going to pretend to explain them, but I'm just going to say them as an illustration of what I'm talking about. Jesus eats with the who are those guys? Publicans. With the publicans and the prostitutes. And so the scribes and Pharisees say, what are you doing? You're eating with these terrible people, and don't you know that they're public sinners, the publicans and the prostitutes? And Jesus says, look, find out what this means. It's not the well people that need the doctor, it's the sick people. I haven't come to save the just, I've come to save those who are lost. He prefers the company. There's evidence for it, right? In the Bible. He prefers the company of prostitutes and publicans. A publican is not a man that keeps a bar. A publican is a man that's soliciting funds for the occupation troops, for the Roman occupation troops who are occupying Jerusalem. They've occupied it, they've taken over the government, they've squashed and squished the religion. They're terrible. And so the worst guys in the world are the publicans. The prostitutes are far better, at least they keep the money. The publicans are giving it to the Roman troops after they collect it. So they're awful people. Jesus prefers them, those people. Why? Why does he prefer them? He tells this parable. The Pharisee and I always feel just a twinge of self-consciousness when I talk about the Pharisees because it's my name, right? Well, When I was a little boy in St. Mark's Church, my parents would take us all, the whole family, to church on Sunday. And I'd sit there and the priest would say, "And Jesus said to the Pharisees." And I would think, wow, you know, he didn't talk to the Murphys, he didn't talk to the O'Briens, he was talking to us. Then I found out who they were. But anyway, the Pharisee and the publican are in the temple, and here's the Pharisee, he's up in front. He's telling the Lord, thanking the Lord. So he's doing something good, right? He's thanking the Lord for the great graces and favors that he's received from the Lord. The Lord has been so good to this Pharisee that he's fasting a lot, and he's giving a lot of his money to the synagogue, and he's just terrific. And he really is terrific. See, the parable is not that the Pharisee's a bad guy and the publican's a good guy. Just the opposite. The good guy is the Pharisee. He's wonderful. He's a model of Jewish piety. He's doing it right. When you pray, in the old days, if you were a Jew, you'd go to the front of the synagogue, you raise your eyes to heaven, you lift up your hands, and you talk to God out loud. And he's doing it just right. The guy is terrific. The publican, on the other hand, is a disaster. He's a mess. In the first place, he's in the back of the church. He doesn't raise his hands like he's supposed to. He doesn't say a set prayer like quoting a psalm or something. He says, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner," which is not even a prayer anywhere in any book. And he doesn't even raise his eyes to heaven. And he doesn't repent. He can't repent without losing his job. He's living a very sinful life being a publican. And there's no sign here in the parable that he's going to stop doing what he's doing, which is taking the money from the good Jewish people and giving it to the dastardly Roman troops, which that's what he's doing. He's not going to repent. He's not repentant. I mean, at least not enough. He may be repentant, but not enough to quit his job, not enough to change his life. He's not going to be converted. And yet, Jesus says, that man found favor with God. Not the Pharisee, but the publican. Well, sir, it's a mysterious business. Why does Jesus prefer these awful people? Because they're lowly. Because they know who they are. They know they're sinners, and they know they're forgiven. And they're doing the best they can under the circumstances, which in fact is terrible, but they find favor with God because they're lowly. And that's the kind of lowliness that I'm talking about. It's a sine qua non condition for entering into that kind of a relationship with the Lord, for contemplation. It's a sine qua non. I mean, there's no substitute for that kind of lowliness. Jesus said he didn't come to save the just, but sinners. He didn't come, the doctor's not for those who are well. He's not telling the Pharisees and the scribes that they're well or that they're just. They are pretty well, I mean, by all appearances, and they do behave like just people, but they're complacent. They lack lowliness. They lack humility before God and before other people as well. They don't have it. And so they're not accepting Jesus. And they're not contemplatives. A contemplative, if you're in contemplative prayer, you are accepting the Lord and His love and His truth. And you're accepting Him. And without a certain amount of lowliness and knowing who I am, a sinner, forgiven but still a sinner, I can't do that. And the Pharisees couldn't do it. They were too full of themselves. They were too puffed up with hot air, with their own righteousness and their own wellness and their own justification and their own goodness and their own respectability, so that the non-respectable people were getting into heaven ahead of them. Huh? So there you are. And I was going to use this, and I think I will, in fact. This is an audio-visual aid, just to show you how modern I am. Okay. Time. Can you see this? Freedom. Lowliness and humility. These are letters, in case they're not pictures of anything. And simplicity. By simplicity, I mean that contemplative prayer isn't really a technique. It's not a technology. It's not spiritual engineering or something. And the Lord, pretty well, the Lord leads. The Lord leads, and I follow. I really learned about this by reflecting on my own experience. When I was 12 years old, I was very small for my age, but I had the biggest mouth in the neighborhood. And so I was always in fights. And I don't have a big nose, but I have high cheekbones. And so for years, like 4 years in a row, one eye or both were always black, because I was always in fights. And in my neighborhood, you didn't lose until you said, I give up. Well, I couldn't win because I was too little, but I couldn't lose because I was too proud to say I give up. So I just kept getting black eyes. My father decided I lacked social graces, and he said, we're sending you to learn ballroom dancing. So every Sunday night, I'd have to get in the car with Mrs. Margaret and her daughter Lois, and we'd drive over to Minneapolis and go up to the 5th floor of this hotel, and Miss What's-Her-Name would put the record on the record player, and she'd say, maybe it was a waltz or something, she'd say, choose your partners, and then maybe 65 girls were over here, and 65 boys were over here, all 12 years old, and they'd come out like this. I'm from Minnesota. Most of the people there in Minnesota are of Scandinavian descent. I'm not. I'm of Irish descent. But the Scandinavian girls, especially in Minneapolis, I mean, they're big. These girls were big girls. I was the smallest one in that ballroom dancing class, including all the girls, and especially I got to tell you this story. My mother died of Alzheimer's, and it's supposed to be sad, but actually when she had Alzheimer's, she was the happiest she'd ever been. So I wasn't too unhappy either. But she couldn't remember anything. And some years before she died, when I was visiting her in St. Paul, she said, dear, I don't know what to do. I can't go to Mass, and I can't say the Rosary, and I can't pray, and I can't read prayers. I don't know what to do. I said, hey, why don't you try something real simple, like just saying a few words, like that, and being with the Lord that way. She said, what'll I say? I said, well, try this. Jesus, help me. Just keep repeating that real slow, but don't stop repeating it. Just keep right on saying, Jesus, help me. And she said, will it work? I said, sure. So then I went away. I came back about 6 months later to St. Paul, and my brother said, what did you tell Mother? I said, I don't know. She's in the nursing home, and all day long, for about 18 hours a day, at the top of her voice, she's saying, Jesus, help me, and she's driving everyone bonkers. And when they tell her to be quiet, she says, my son is a priest, and he told me to do it. So I said, okay, guys, I'll go out there. She's supposed to do it silently, but all right, so I'll go out there. So I go out to the nursing home, and I'm going down this long corridor towards the clearing where the television's, not the sound, but just the picture is on, but nobody's watching it because all the little old ladies are in their wheelchairs, and they're all bombed out on drugs because that's the way the nurses put them, so there won't be any trouble, especially my mother. And so they're all bombed out on drugs, and they're just kind of staring in space and not talking to each other. So I'm coming down this long corridor towards this clearing where I know they're all out there in their wheelchairs. And I hear a familiar voice saying, Jesus, help me, Jesus, help me. And I think, I know who that is. And so I get to the end of the corridor, I go into the room, my mother looks at me, her eyes get real big, and she says, it works. Anyway, that's a bad example of how to do centering prayer. But then she started doing it silently, and I think she was afraid to die, really. But she started just praying like that, very silently, and then after just a few weeks, one day she just completely changed, lost her fear of dying, and the next day she died. Well, why don't we just try it? What do you got to lose? Nothing, right? Try it. So let's just try centering prayer. Because laboratory exercise. You won't get any extra credit for it. Well, you might. If you're a Catholic, we believe in merit. You might get merit. If you're a Protestant, you don't get any. So, all right, let's just try this. You take the name of Jesus, put it in your heart, and let it repeat itself very slowly, very slowly. Jesus, Jesus. We'll just try it. We'll try for a minute or a minute and a half, something like that. Lord, we ask you to help us to be with you, Lord. To be with you using this centering prayer and to be centered on you. Thank you, Lord. Amen. How'd it go? Just a second. How did it go? All right. So, there are two other ways of contemplation that aren't usually thought of as contemplative, but they are strictly contemplative. One is the way most people who say the rosary a lot say the rosary. I've already talked about it. The Our Fathers and the Hail Marys simply block the mind from having thoughts. And they keep you along the lines of non-conceptual prayer, and they keep the distractions away. And most people, when they say the rosary, they're looking at Jesus and Mary, or one or the other, in the various mysteries, the joyful mysteries, the sorrowful mysteries, the glorious mysteries. And they really are contemplative. I had a friend who was a beggar lady in Rome. I live in Rome. And she used to sit on the steps of an underground passage every day until she was a beggar. And when she collected enough money to get some groceries, then she'd go to the store, get some groceries, go home and cook them for her meal, and then that was it. She just had one meal a day. She's been dead now for maybe 10 years. A very holy woman, and a wonderful woman, and a sweet woman. But she didn't know anything except the rosary. That's the only kind of prayer she knew. But she was a great contemplative, there's no question. Finally, another way to contemplate, and this is, I suppose, in some ways the most interesting, is the gift of tongues. When you find people in the charismatic or Pentecostal tradition, and now of course that tradition cuts across even all the mainline churches and Roman Catholicism too. When you find people that do use the gift of tongues, almost always that's a contemplative gift. In fact, always, as far as I can tell. The gift of tongues really is vocalized contemplation. It's noisy contemplation. People at the University of Minnesota years ago taped literally thousands of Pentecostal tongue speakers and tongue singers, people speaking in tongues and singing in tongues. And then they turned over the tapes to the linguistics department to be studied to see if anybody speaking in tongues had a linguistic structure. Because St. Paul talks about speaking the tongues of men and angels. Well, we don't know what angels, what they talk like, or Martians, or people in other galaxies. We don't know what they talk like. And so somebody might say, well, when I speak in tongues, I might be speaking some unknown language. But what the linguistic structure people discovered is that no one on any of the thousands of tapes, no one, not a single one of those tongue speakers was using anything that had a linguistic structure. So they weren't speaking languages. When people speak in tongues or pray in tongues, that's not a language. You can have a miracle. You can always have miracles. But barring a miracle, it's not a language. What is it? It's syllables that don't make any sense. That's all. What's the point? The point is, it's contemplative. It's non-conceptual prayer. It's prayer without words, prayer without ideas. It's just being with the Lord in praise or adoration or something, worship. It's just being with the Lord. It's contemplation. I know a woman, I was going to say a young woman, but she's not young anymore, but she was once. Anyway, she came to me once just to ask for some spiritual direction. I said, okay, how's your prayer going? She said, fine. I said, how often do you pray? Oh, she said, every day. How long? About 3 hours. 3 hours a day, yeah. What do you do? I pray in tongues. She prays in tongues for 3 hours a day. Admittedly, it's an exception. I've only run across that once. But the exception proves the rule. I didn't want to tinker with that, you know. If it's not broken, I don't want to start fixing it. So if that's the way the Lord led her, that's the way the Lord led her. And that was her prayer. A remarkable woman. And I know I was the spiritual director for about a year, 2 years maybe, of a nurse in London who came into Christianity from a pagan religion. She wasn't born in England. She came in from a pagan religion, and her first experience of Christianity and her conversion experience was going into an Anglican church during a charismatic prayer meeting. And so for the first time she prayed, they prayed over her right away, right? They thought, here's a live one, and they baptized her in the Holy Spirit. And she started praying in tongues. So every morning, this nurse, I'm sure she's still doing it, every morning before she goes to work, she gets up, prays in tongues for an hour, goes off to Mass, and then goes off to the hospital. That's what she does. A wonderful woman. And when she first came to me, I said, well, don't you do anything besides pray in tongues? No. I go to Mass. Anything else? No. Read the Bible. That's it, yeah. You never feel like praying any other way than in tongues? No? Okay. So those are two people out of, I suppose, thousands that I've talked to, that their whole prayer, their whole contemplative prayer is praying in tongues. But that's valid. That's a valid way. And in a group this size, there are going to be some people that have had the Pentecostal or the charismatic experience. If you have had, fine. If you have the gift of tongues, the main use of it in all Christian tradition is in personal prayer, not in group prayer. The main use of the gift of tongues is in personal prayer. And I use it every morning to start my prayer, because it gets me right into it. And then I just stop after 30 seconds or a minute, and I'm with the Lord. It's a good way. Gifts are to be used anyway. And it's a good way to start your prayer. And there are always a few people, exceptions, I'll admit, for whom their contemplative prayer will be just praying in tongues. Just as there are other people for whom their contemplative prayer won't be anything other than saying the rosary. Just as there are other people for whom their contemplative prayer won't be anything other than centering prayer. I know a sister that's all she does. Even at Mass, she's just doing centering prayer. Okay, fine. That's her way. That's the way the Lord leads her. But those are valid ways of contemplative prayer. There is one more thing, and I don't want to go on forever, but I am going to talk about it because it's part of it's part of the Christian tradition of contemplative prayer, but especially of the Catholic tradition, and in a particular way of my own Jesuit tradition, because you didn't betray me by blowing my cover and saying I was a Jesuit, but I am. I admit it publicly. And we do have a tradition of the discernment of spirits. The discernment of spirits is what? It's discerning, really, whether something is from the Lord or not from the Lord. maybe it's from the Lord, or maybe it's from the world, the flesh, the devil, or just something I ate for breakfast. But that's discernment of spirits, to know whether this is from the Lord or not. That's it. Is this idea that I've got to completely revolutionize the religious studies department, is that from the Lord, or is that just my own hubris? Is this idea that I have to trade in the old car and buy a new one, is that really from the Lord, or is that just me trying to, show off with a sportier car? Whatever. Discernment of spirits is often at the basis of making a decision, because I want to make my decisions knowing which way the Lord is leaning on this decision. I want to do what He wants. Should I volunteer to go to the missions or not? This is a discernment I've been making since I was 25 years old, and it always turns out I should volunteer, and I always volunteer, and they never send me. However, that's a whole other question. That's how I learned about discernment of spirits, by trying to figure out whether or not I should volunteer to go on the missions. But I'm only 70 years old, and so my time will come yet. Why am I talking about it in a talk on contemplative prayer? Because it's contemplative. And if the discernment of spirits is not contemplation, if it's not contemplative, it's no good. It won't work. There's no way of consulting the Lord except by being there with Him, contemplating, and seeing how this idea sets with Him. And then going, what are the criteria? I'm there with the Lord, eyeball to eyeball, heart to heart, face to face with the Lord, and I'm seeing whether this idea of going to the volunteering for the missions or not, how does that sit with Him? Is this idea of my going to the missions congruent with the idea He's got for me in His heart? Is there a congruency? Do I get good vibrations? When I'm face to face with the Lord, how do I feel He feels about this thing? Do I feel a certain rightness? Do I have a certain facility in relating to Him, or in being in union with Him, in relationship with this idea, regarding this idea? That's the general idea. Here's a good example. I mean, it's a terrible example, but it makes the point. If you ever have a dog, now here we are in Nova Scotia, so it's pretty cold. It's like, it can get almost like Minnesota maybe, right? In the wintertime, the dogs are inside a lot, aren't they? How many people here have dogs? Okay. So you're going to understand it. You have to housebreak the dog. And if you go out, if I go out of the house and I come back and the dog has messed up the carpet, you've never seen anyone more repentant than a dog who has messed up the carpet. They are really repentant because they're afraid of getting hit with a rolled up newspaper on the nose. That's what they're afraid of. So I open the door, there's the dog, he's sitting in the middle of the carpet and he's looking at me and he's wondering, okay, what's he going to do now? Is he going to hit me with a rolled up newspaper? Is he going to rub my nose in it? Is he going to forgive me? What's he going to do? That dog is discerning. That's what he's doing. It's a graphic example. That's what I want to do with the Lord. I want to go to the Lord and say, which way are you leaning on this thing here? Is this from you or is this not from you? Should I tell the Father General I want to volunteer to go to, where was I? One time I was going to Northern Rhodesia. Now it's, Zambia. Should I tell the General I want to go to Zambia? Send me or not? And I'm looking at the Lord like the dog looks at his master. And He will eventually, if I keep it up over a period of time, a little bit every day, say a couple weeks for important decisions, He'll get through to me. He'll get through to me, and that'll be important input. Obviously, I've got objective criteria. If I'm too old, I can't volunteer for the missions, like if I'm over 100, for example. It's too old. So there are objective criteria. I can't trade in the old car and get a new one if I don't have an old car to begin with, or if I don't have the money for the down payments for the new car. So I've got a certain amount of objective input here. But even when I weigh the pros and cons, in light of all the pros and cons, very often I still don't know what I should do. Should I enroll in this university or in this other university? Should I major in this subject or in that subject? Should I accept the offer to take this job or this position or not accept it? Usually the discernment that works best is binary. Yes, no. Lord, do you want this or not? Is this idea really from you or not? Is it your plan for me that I do this, or is your plan for me that I not do it? When it's a yes-no thing, the Lord can get through to us a little more plainly. But the only way He can do it is in terms of contemplation, in terms of contemplative prayer. I go to Him I consult Him. There's a psalm that says, why are you always think you're doing my will when you never consult me? Where is that? Well, it doesn't matter. I should have gone to a Protestant seminary. I would know all these things. So, instead of metaphysics. Anyway, that's it. If I have contemplative prayer, if I have a prayer life that includes contemplation, and I have a relationship with the Lord, that kind of a union with the Lord, then I can go to Him and I can consult Him about what His plans are for me or my group or my family or for whomever I have a certain amount of input in the decision making. I can do that. Okay, well, that's all really that I have to say, and what I would ask now is if you have any thoughts, questions, observations, recriminations, or relevant anecdotes. Raise your hand. I can see you now. Yes, did you have your hand up? I've got to get new glasses. Yes?
Father Faircy, you didn't mention the contemplation of the works of God or contemplation of nature, and
Yeah.
I think that's very important. Could you speak on it?
Well, it's using, yes. I didn't mention it because it's an analogous use of the word contemplation. Can I contemplate nature? Absolutely. I can. And a lot of people find that being in nature or with nature, I have a friend who's always talking about taking a nature walk, and she gets closer to God that way. And it's fine. I can contemplate nature and move right from nature to God. And there's a very long and important Christian tradition about doing that. But contemplating nature is not really contemplating God. So I didn't want to bring it in, and that's why. But I'm glad you mentioned it, because now we can talk about it. There are a number of ways, you might say, of getting to God, of being with the Lord. And I mentioned some ways of contemplative prayer. And a way that I didn't mention is this, right? To be with nature or in nature or contemplating nature or looking at nature, and to move from there to the Creator, to move from there to God, to move from there to the Lord of nature and to the Lord of all things. But it isn't really contemplation in the strict sense of the word as long as I remain with nature. It's when I move from that to Him in whom all of that is anchored and rooted and exists and has its being, and who made all these beautiful things. It's not until I really move to a being with Him or to a praising, a non-conceptual praising or adoring of Him that I really enter into contemplative prayer. Thank you for that. That was perfect. I mean, thanks. I'm glad now I didn't talk about it because you did, and then I could. Thank you. Yes, yes, sir.
In seeking to know the will of the Lord for you.
In seeking to know the will of the Lord for me.
Or for me.
Or for you.
Or for any.
Right.
experienced being left without an answer?
Yes. Have I experienced being left without an answer? The questions are wonderful. That's a good one. One time I was, Victor Mertens, who was the Jesuit in charge of Africa. I was over in our generalate in Rome and walking on the corridor, and Victor Mertens stopped me and he said, listen, I was about maybe 55 at the time. He said, listen, I've got to find somebody to go to WAU in southern Sudan, W-A-U, to be the first prefect of studies of the first seminary in southern Sudan, which is a big Christian area. It's where there's a lot of trouble right now. One of the wars that isn't getting much in the paper, but it's going on. It's a terrible persecution of Christians. Awful. And it hadn't started yet at that time. And so Victor said to me, do you know anyone who has at least a master's degree in theology? I got to have somebody with a master's degree or a doctorate whom I can send down there to get the thing started. I've got a material man who can handle all the logistics, but I don't have a man who can go down there and organize the academic side of the seminary. So I thought, Victor, I said, give me 2 weeks, I'll get back to you. And of course I thought, I'm the guy. I'm a little old, but I got a doctorate in theology. I'm better than a master's degree. My health is good. I'll get Victor to send me. First, I'll make my discernment. And so every morning and every evening, I'd go into the chapel, and I'd ask the Lord, okay, should I volunteer to go to WOW or not? And I got nothing. I got nothing for about 12 days. And so I told the Lord, listen, I got to say something to Victor, and I don't have anybody else's name because I haven't asked anyone. So what are you telling me here? And I got no answer. That night, the night of the 12th day, I went to bed. I got into bed, said a few prayers, turned out the lights, started to go to sleep, and all of a sudden, I was half asleep, right? The Lord had to get me punchy. I don't drink that much, so he couldn't rely on that. He had to get me punchy to get through to me. All of a sudden, I found myself saying, okay, I'll go. And I was just flooded with joy. And I jumped out of bed. I said, Lord, that's it. You want me to go? You want me to volunteer to go to southern Sudan to start this seminary? And that's what he wanted me to do, to volunteer. Why did it take 12 days? So I had to think about that, right? And pray about it. And I'm sure that the reason it took so long and that the Lord couldn't get through to me until I was half asleep and punch drunk is that I really didn't want to go. I was very attached to the idea of Bob Faricy, a little old but a great missionary, converting all the black heathen in WOW and training these boys to be seminarians. The idea of my going to Africa in glory, I really liked that idea. I was not attached to going or to serving the Lord. I was attached to the idea of myself as a heroic Albert Schweitzer type missionary. That's what I was attached to. And I couldn't give that up. But I didn't really want to leave Rome. I didn't really want to leave my job. I didn't really want to leave the prestige of my position. And I didn't want to leave the comforts of home, all my friends, and all the stuff I was plugged into. But when I was half asleep, the Lord got me to say, all right, I'll go, and then he gave me the consolation that confirmed that that's what he wanted. As it turned out, I couldn't go. The general wouldn't let me go. I went to my dean. Before I saw the general, I went to my dean, and I said, I'm going to WOW. And he said, you can't go. You can't leave us in the lurch like this. But if you go to Africa, all right, you go. You've made up your mind. You're going. Never come back here again. Never come. And then I went to the general, and he said, you can't go. So I had to go back to the dean and say, I'm back. Yes, I think that when there's no answer in discernment, it's because I'm blocking the answer. And usually, it's because I lack the interior freedom. It's because I already have made up my mind, maybe only semi-consciously, what I want to do. I didn't really want to go to WOW. I liked the idea of my going, but I didn't really want to go. And until the Lord could get me in a position of relative interior freedom, he couldn't get through to me to let me know what he wanted me to do. He didn't want me to go to WOW because I believe in obeying your superiors. It's the only virtue that Jesuits have, actually, and we don't have that very well. But he wanted me to volunteer. He wanted me to be free enough to go. He just didn't want me to go. So he worked it out. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Father, does St. Ignatius have different levels of contemplation?
Ignatius, yes. We have, thanks. I don't want to intimidate anybody, but the questions so far have been wonderful. But I don't want to keep anybody from asking further questions. I'm using the word contemplation in its generally accepted sense in the Christian tradition, and especially in the Catholic tradition. But you've also got what I think we can call, what is called, in fact, Ignatian contemplation. This is contemplation as the way St. Ignatius Loyola talks about it in his spiritual exercises and in some of his other writings, letters especially. Is there a difference between Ignatian contemplation and contemplation? Yes. Ignatian contemplation is broader. In the Christian tradition, contemplation means what I've been talking about. Non-conceptual prayer of the heart, union with the Lord, being with Him. In Teresa of Avila's words, what did she say? Being with the one that I know loves me, looking at the Lord, knowing Him through love, whatever words you want to use, that's contemplation in the ordinarily accepted sense. When you talk about Ignatian contemplation, you mean that, but you also mean, well, here we go. Okay, I might as well tell you. I can read a passage from the Gospel. The flight into Egypt. Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus are on this donkey or whatever, and they're off going into Egypt. I can have an image of that. These are the levels of Ignatian contemplation, right? At one level, I can have an image, a kind of a mental picture. I can enter into it. I can meditate on it. I can ask myself questions. Who's going to Egypt? What are they wearing? What are they saying? Maybe how do they feel about going to Egypt? I can reflect on it. I can think about it. Or I can just have an image of it and kind of enter into the image. Or, and I'm moving to another level, I can actually try to make myself present at that historic moment when they were on their way. And I can try to feel what they were feeling and maybe think a little bit what they were thinking and kind of be with them on their journey on the flight into Egypt. Or, and this is the last level of Ignatian contemplation, and all these levels, they're not precise, they're sort of overlapping, right? The last level would be real contemplation in the ordinary sense of the word, where I enter into the Lord's heart. I mean, He's got total recall. He's risen. He knows exactly what happened on the flight into Egypt. I simply am with the Lord. I enter into His heart in order to find the hidden, secret, real, but inarticulable meaning of that particular mystery of the life of the Lord, the flight into Egypt, and I'm just with the Lord in non-conceptual prayer. Those are the various levels of Ignatian contemplation. But sometimes you can get into a certain amount of confusion when you say contemplation if you're talking to people in the Ignatian or the Jesuit tradition, because Ignatian contemplation is much broader. It's like genus and species, right? This is the broadest category. This means almost any kind of prayer. Ignatian contemplation means anything except just thinking. If there's any relationality at all in my prayer, or any kind of union with the Lord in my prayer, it can come under the rubric or under the title of Ignatian contemplation in one form or another, one level or another. But at its highest levels, Ignatian contemplation is contemplation in the ordinary sense of the word. Why is that important? Because in the spiritual exercises, when people make the spiritual exercises, which involve a certain number of contemplations, right? Well, you can have people that are already in contemplative prayer. Good. They just make those contemplations in a real contemplative way. Although, and now I'm going to tell you more than you want to know, but you asked me, when people make the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, in a directed retreat in particular, but also it happens in preached retreats, when they make the spiritual exercises, very often their prayer changes. And a person whose prayer is not so contemplative may find that that person is much more contemplative in the retreat. Or conversely, a person whose prayer is very contemplative may find that that same person is doing a little more reasoning, a little more imaginative praying. The prayer will be less contemplative because maybe the Lord wants to do something special there in your retreat. So he'll change your prayer just for the time of the retreat. That happens not infrequently. Or maybe your prayer just stays pretty much the same. So I told you far more than you asked, but that's what you get. Anybody else? I heard a voice. Yes. Yes, sir.
Father, could you speak a little bit about time? I know you said God doesn't have a clock, but in centering prayer, I know, and in the prayer that's taught by John Maine, they mention 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the evening. Just wondered if you could speak about that as far as, when a person could pray and timings and that kind of thing.
Right.
Best benefit.
I mentioned a friend of mine who does centering prayer. She does 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the evening. And she's a wonderful woman, believe me. She's a nun that I worked with for years. She's great. That's fine for her. I don't think it depends on personality. I tend to do everything very quickly. I don't do much, but what I do is fast. I read fast. I work fast. I clean. Whatever I do fast. But I don't pray fast. I need at least an hour a day. Besides Mass, Breviary, all the rest of it, I need at least an hour of contemplative prayer every day. And if I didn't have that, I'd probably run off with a woman 2 inches taller and 2 years older in about a year. Like so many of my friends. I need it. So I think it just depends on the person. But certainly, I'd say 20 minutes twice a day to have a real prayer life, that'd be a minimum. That'd be an absolute minimum. I don't think there is any maximum. It just depends on the person and on. But it's not a question. I used to have a friend that used to say, if you're too busy to pray, you're too busy. It's not a question of not having time, because you've always got time. You've always got the time you need to do what you really want to do. And if the Lord has a certain priority in your life, then there is time for prayer. There is time for contemplative prayer. That's there. The question is, how much does he want me to have? In other words, the exact question is not how much time do I need. The question is, how much time does he need? How much time does he need to work on me? That's the real question. And I don't know, you just got to work it out. But I wouldn't think that two 20-minute periods a day would be an absolute minimum, and probably not sufficient at all for most people. Maybe a half hour twice a day, that might go. Or an hour a day, a couple hours a day, something like that. Where I find people have problems, and this is a problem I've never had, is young mothers with children. They have trouble. But they can work it out. There's a way of being with your children and watching over them, or maybe they take a nap, right? There's a way of being with them and doing what you're supposed to do and still being with the Lord. That's possible. Anyone else? Yes, this will be the last one.
There's a lot of comments about our having forgotten tradition meditation. And
There are a lot of comments about our having forgotten.
Having forgotten the tradition of meditation,
Yeah.
particularly among Catholic community.
Right.
And people who are impressed by the work of John Maine feel that they've recaptured something which has been notably absent.
I don't think there's any question. The John Maine is a man who was a monk, who's deceased. But he started a meditation movement among Catholics, and now it's broader than just Catholics. And it's a great thing. It's really contemplative prayer, using a mantra. And it's great. I'm all for it. If you're looking for some kind of a movement of contemplative prayer to get into, the John Maine movement is a good one. However, I think it's part of something much broader. I was ordained, I became a Jesuit in 1950. Up until about 1965, 67, long after I was ordained, I didn't see very many graces of contemplative prayer. You could count them on the fingers of one hand. Since about 1967, 1968, I find graces of contemplative prayer everywhere, and not just in Catholicism, all over Christianity. And maybe the Muslims have got it, for all I know. I know they're singing in tongues in the Catholic Charismatic Prayer Group in Cairo, so maybe they got some graces too. But I've never seen such an outpouring of graces of contemplative prayer in the various Christian denominations as I have since about 1967, 1968, 69. It's massive. Now, you can account for that with a lot of sociological reasons and a lot of theological reasons, and that's interesting, of course, but the fact is, this is what the Lord is doing. The Lord is doing this. He's pouring out graces of contemplative prayer. I find graces of contemplative prayer now in young people sometimes, 20, 18, 25, that you wouldn't have expected in 1955 to find in a Trappist monk of, say, 65, 70 years old. The Lord is really giving a lot of graces of contemplative prayer. Maybe it has something to do with Vatican II. Maybe it has something to do with societies loosening up. Maybe it has something to do with a fad. I don't know. I think it mostly has to do with the Lord's love and generosity. But the John Maine movement that's important. Thank you. Well, listen, I'm grateful to you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And before we part, I want you to know that you are all invited back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in the same auditorium for Robert Faricy's reflection on Zen meditation, and tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock, where he will develop models of Christian contemplation such as Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and Thomas Merton. Also, I would like to use this opportunity to bring to your attention that next month, November the 4th,